My name is Sophia. I am 32 years old. I've spent the last decade of my life as a forensic accountant in Boston, a profession that teaches you one fundamental truth about the human condition. People lie, but numbers eventually tell the truth. In my line of work, you don't look at a person's eyes to see if they are guilty. You look at their ledgers. You watch the trail of ink, the digital footprints left in the dark, the quiet shifting of decimals when they think nobody is paying attention. My family always found me cold. They called me detached, too clinical, the boring daughter who preferred the company of spreadsheets to the vibrant, performative warmth of their country club dinners in Connecticut. They liked their illusions. I preferred reality. And reality, in its cruelest, most naked form, arrived on a suffocating Tuesday morning at JFK International Airport, Terminal 4. I will never forget the expression on my father Richard's face as the heavy glass doors of the departure gate began to slide shut. It was a look of profound, unadulterated relief. A smug, tiny smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth, the look of a man who had just pulled off the perfect heist and gotten away with it. He was 78-year-old Beatrice's son, her only boy, and yet he was leaving her standing there, stranded in the middle of a chaotic, roaring terminal, while he and my mother boarded a flight to Europe. My grandmother had paid my father $30,000 to be part of this dream family vacation across the continent. It was supposed to be a 3-week celebration of her twilight years, a chance to see Paris one last time. But Richard possessed a unique brand of arrogance, a cruelty so smooth it almost looked like politeness. At the check-in desk, with a rehearsed gasp and a theatrical wave of his hands, he told her that the airline had accidentally canceled her ticket due to a system glitch. He looked her in the eye, patted her frail shoulder, and told her there were no other seats available. Then, he guided her toward a yellow cab, packed her bags into the trunk, and sent her back to Connecticut alone. What he didn't realize was that I had seen right through the performance. I didn't board that plane. As they walked down the jet bridge, thinking they were going to spend the next 3 weeks sipping champagne in Paris at her expense, I stood by the trash can near the gate and slowly tore my own boarding pass into pieces. They thought they had left an old woman helpless. They didn't realize they had left her with a forensic accountant. While they were somewhere over the Atlantic, I was already freezing my grandmother's assets, revoking my father's power of attorney, and quietly feeding his sham consulting firm into the jaws of the IRS. Before I take you into the cold calculations behind those stolen dreams, subscribe to the channel. This isn't just a story, it's a ledger of accounts being settled. Stay with me. The air inside Terminal 4 smelled faintly of burnt coffee, jet fuel, and the distinct, metallic tang of collective anxiety. The terminal was a sea of moving bodies, a blurring kaleidoscope of rolling suitcases and frantic announcements blaring from the overhead speakers. But within our small circle, time seemed to slow down to a cruel, agonizing crawl. My mother, Caroline, stood slightly to the left, her fingers rhythmically tapping against the cardboard sleeve of her oversized, extra-hot oat milk latte. Her nails were a pristine, pale pink, ballet slippers, her usual shade, and the click-click-click of her acrylics against the cup was the only sign of her impatience. She wouldn't look at Beatrice. Caroline hated the slow pace of aging. She hated the way my grandmother's hands trembled slightly when she reached for her purse, the way she had to ask people to repeat themselves in crowded rooms. To Caroline, Beatrice wasn't a matriarch. She was an anchor dragging down the sleek, aerodynamic ship of their social status. "It's just devastating, Mom," Richard was saying, his voice carrying that booming, charismatic resonance he used when he was closing a questionable real estate deal in Greenwich. He was leaning in, his hands resting gently on Beatrice's shoulders. To an outsider, it looked like a portrait of filial devotion. A son comforting his elderly mother. The gate agent says the booking code was completely wiped from the system. "It's an overbooked flight. They gave your seat away." I'm furious, absolutely furious. Beatrice stood small beneath his touch. She was wearing her finest traveling coat, a classic navy wool trench she had bought decades ago, its brass buttons polished to a dull shine. Her silver hair was perfectly coiffed, a fragile armor against the world. She looked up at him, her pale blue eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and heartbreak. "But Richard," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the roar of a nearby escalator. "The check cleared 3 weeks ago. You said you took care of everything. I wanted to see the Tillerys again." "And you will, sweetheart. Just not today," Richard said smoothly, already checking his Rolex. The gold bezel caught the harsh fluorescent lighting of the terminal. "Listen to me. There's no point in all of us missing the flight and losing thousands of dollars. Caroline and I will go ahead, get settled in Paris, and I will call the airline's executive corporate office the minute we land. We'll get this sorted out. I'll wire you the refund, and we'll fly you out first class next week. I promise." He didn't mean a single word. I knew that tone. It was the same tone he used when he told his real estate clients that the water damage in the basement was just condensation. Caroline took a delicate sip of her latte, leaving a faint smear of pink lipstick on the plastic lid. "Richard, honey, we have to go. The final boarding call is active. If we miss the window, they won't let us on." She finally looked at Beatrice, offering a tight, hollow smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Go home and rest, Beatrice. The city is so exhausting anyway. It's probably a blessing in disguise." I watched them. I stood 3 feet away, a ghost in their peripheral vision. I watched my father flag down an airport porter, hand him a crisp $20 bill, and instruct him to take Beatrice down to the taxi stand. He didn't even walk her to the curb himself. He just gave her one last, patronizing pat on the back, turned around, and offered his arm to my mother. As they walked toward the glass doors of the jet bridge, Richard leaned down and whispered something into Caroline's ear. That was when I saw it. The smirk. The absolute, unbothered ease of a predator who had just successfully pushed the weakest member of the pack out into the cold. "Sophia, come on," Caroline called back over her shoulder, noticing for the first time that I wasn't following them. "They're closing the doors." "I'm not coming," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it had the flat, unyielding weight of an iron bar. Caroline stopped. Richard turned around, his eyebrows knitting together in annoyance. "What do you mean you're not coming? Don't be dramatic, Sophia. We don't have time for your moods," he snapped, his charming facade cracking just enough to let the irritation leak through. I didn't answer him. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out the crisp, laser-printed boarding pass, and folded it in half. Then in half again. I tore it down the middle, the sound of the paper ripping clean and sharp against the ambient noise of the airport. I dropped the pieces into the gray recycling bin next to me. "Go to Paris, Dad," I said softly. "You've earned it." He stared at me for 3 long seconds. In his mind, he was calculating the cost of my wasted ticket, but his greed was quickly overtaken by his selfishness. If I stayed behind, it meant nobody was on the trip to judge him. It meant he didn't have to pretend to be a good son or a good father for 3 weeks. "Suit yourself," he muttered. He grabbed Caroline's hand, and they walked through the gate. The doors slid shut behind them with a heavy, pressurized hiss. I turned my back on the airplanes. I walked down the long, echoing corridor of Terminal 4, my boots clicking against the polished linoleum until I reached the lower level. I found Beatrice sitting on a metal bench near the taxi stand. Her suitcase was parked next to her, looking incredibly large and heavy against her fragile frame. She was staring straight ahead, watching the endless stream of yellow cabs pull up, load, and depart. She looked like a woman who had suddenly realized the ground beneath her feet wasn't solid earth, but thin ice. "Sophia?" she asked as I stepped into her line of sight. She blinked, her hands tightening around the handle of her leather purse. "Why aren't you on the plane? You're going to miss Paris." "Paris isn't going anywhere, Grandma," I said, sitting down beside her. The metal bench was freezing. I reached over and took her hand. Her fingers were like ice, frail and trembling.
"Come on.
Let's go home." The ride back to Connecticut was silent. The taxi driver, a quiet man with a tired face, seemed to understand the heavy atmosphere inside the car and left the radio off. Outside the window, the industrial gray sprawl of Queens slowly gave way to the highways of New York and eventually the tree-lined, wealthy lanes of Fairfield County. Beatrice stared out the window the entire time, her chin resting in her hand. She didn't cry. The women in our family don't cry easily. We internalize. We let the cold settle into our bones until it turns into something hard and sharp. When we finally pulled into the driveway of her colonial-style home in New Canaan, the sun was beginning to dip below the tree line, casting long, skeletal shadows across the manicured lawn. This house had belonged to my grandfather, a man who had built a successful manufacturing business from nothing. When he died 10 years ago, he left Beatrice with a substantial estate, a comfortable life, and a deep, unshakable trust in her family. A trust that my father had spent the last several years systematically eroding. I helped Beatrice inside, guiding her to her favorite armchair in the sitting room. I made her a pot of Earl Grey tea, pouring it into the delicate, gold-rimmed porcelain cups she loved so much. "Rest for a bit, Grandma," I said, setting the saucer down on the mahogany side table. "I'm going to go into the study and look up the airline info. I want to see exactly what happened with that ticket." She nodded weakly, her eyes closing as she leaned her head back against the velvet cushion.
"Thank you, Sophia."
"I just don't understand how a computer could just lose a person." I walked down the hallway to the back of the house, where my grandfather's old study remained largely untouched. It was a room filled with the scent of old paper, leather-bound books, and cedar. On the large oak desk sat Beatrice's iPad, resting inside its worn leather case. She used it to check her email and look at photos of gardens. I sat down in the swivel chair, woke the screen, and entered her simple passcode, the year of her wedding. The mail app was already open. The last email received was a confirmation notification from 3 weeks ago, the day she had given Richard the money for the trip. My fingers hovered over the glass. I opened the email. It wasn't a receipt from Delta or Air France. It was a digital invoice generated by a third-party accounting platform. The payment of $30,000 hadn't gone to an airline. It had been deposited directly into the corporate checking account of an entity listed as Crestview Holdings, LLC. I sat there in the quiet study, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner suddenly sounding incredibly loud, like a countdown. Crestview Holdings. I knew that name. I had seen it once on a stray piece of mail left on my father's kitchen counter months ago. It wasn't a travel agency. It wasn't a boutique concierge service. It was a paravan company, a ghost shell registered in the state of Delaware, with a single named managing member, Richard Vance. My father hadn't lost her ticket. He had never bought it. He had taken her $30,000, moved it into his own secret corporate account, and left her to rot at the gate while he used the rest of her money to fund his and Caroline's first-class luxury vacation. A cold, familiar calm washed over me. The emotional weight of the betrayal didn't crush me. Instead, it activated something deep inside my brain. The Adley Muhasebisi woke up. The daughter, who wanted to scream, disappeared, replaced entirely by the woman who knew how to destroy a life using nothing but a keyboard and a stack of financial records. I pulled my professional laptop out of my bag, plugged it into the desk outlet, and began to dig. Richard had left his mother behind for 21 days. He thought he had 3 weeks of total freedom in Europe, completely insulated from the consequences of his cruelty. He didn't know that 21 days was more than enough time for me to dismantle his entire world, dollar by dollar, document by document. The audit had officially begun. The heavy oak door of my grandfather's study clicked shut, sealing me inside a room that smelled of old money, binding glue, and the faint, lingering scent of pipe tobacco. Outside the bay window, the Connecticut sun was completing its descent, bleeding out over the manicured lawns of New Canaan and casting long, bruised shadows across the Persian rug. The house was entirely silent, save for the rhythmic, metronomic ticking of the brass grandfather clock in the corner. It was the perfect environment for an audit. I sat in the high-backed leather chair, adjusting the brightness on my laptop screen until the harsh blue light washed over my face. The email on Beatrice's iPad, the $30,000 invoice paid to Crestview Holdings, was nothing more than a loose thread hanging from the hem of a very expensive, carefully tailored garment. Most people would just cut the thread. A forensic accountant pulls it until the entire suit unravels. I didn't feel anger. Anger is a messy, chaotic emotion that clouds judgment and makes your hands shake. What I felt was a cold, crystalline focus. It was the familiar, almost comforting sensation of slipping into a purely analytical state, where human beings cease to be fathers or mothers and become nothing more than variables in an equation. To understand a financial crime, you have to understand the baseline behavior of the victim. I logged into Beatrice's primary checking account, navigating the two-factor authentication by retrieving the code sent to her iPad. Her ledger was a portrait of a quiet, predictable twilight existence. For the last 5 years, the outflow of capital was practically a flat line. Weekly grocery deliveries from Whole Foods, monthly utility bills, quarterly property taxes, a recurring $200 donation to the local animal shelter. There were no sudden spikes, no erratic spending habits. Beatrice was a creature of routine, which made the anomalies look like jagged, bleeding wounds on the spreadsheet. I exported the last 36 months of her bank statements into a master Excel file and began applying conditional formatting filters. I wasn't just looking for $30,000 anymore. A thief who has the audacity to steal that much money in a single, brazen transaction has never done it for the first time. That level of comfort requires practice. It requires a history of getting away with it. I set the parameters to flag any outgoing wire transfer, ACH payment, or cashier's check exceeding $1,000 that did not match her established vendor list. The screen flickered for a fraction of a second, processing the data. When the results populated, a solid block of red cells illuminated the dark room. My fingers hovered over the trackpad. The silence in the study felt suddenly heavier, as if the air pressure had dropped. 3 years ago, the first unauthorized withdrawal had occurred. It was a modest test run, $2,500, categorized vaguely as property maintenance consultation, wired directly to a secondary account. A month later, $4,200 for estate advisory services. 2 months after that, $7,000. The money was being siphoned primarily from her 401k disbursements and a high-yield liquid savings account my grandfather had set up specifically for her long-term medical care. Every single one of these transfers was routed to the same destination, Crestview Holdings, LLC. I opened a new tab and accessed the Delaware Secretary of State's corporate registry database. Delaware is the preferred playground for people who want to hide their assets. It's a state that allows LLCs to be formed with a suffocating layer of anonymity, shielding the actual owners behind registered agents. But Richard was greedy, and greedy people eventually get lazy. He hadn't wanted to pay the annual retainer for a corporate proxy. I paid the nominal fee to download the original formation documents for Crestview Holdings. The PDF loaded line by line. Under the section titled Managing Member and Authorized Signatory, there it was, printed in stark, undeniable black and white. Richard Vance. Listed with his home address in Greenwich. He had fabricated invoices for fictitious consulting services, charging his own mother exorbitant fees for managing an estate she was perfectly capable of managing herself and legally funneling the cash into his personal shell company. I highlighted the column of fraudulent transfers on my spreadsheet and clicked the AutoSum function. The total materialized at the bottom of the screen. $196,800. Almost $200,000 bled out of an old woman's safety net over 3 years, culminating in the $30,000 final blow disguised as a European vacation. He hadn't just stolen her trip. He had been quietly financing his country club dues, his luxury car leases, and Caroline's endless wardrobe upgrades with the money meant to pay for Beatrice's end-of-life care. Just as I documented the final transaction, the screen of my phone, resting face up on the mahogany desk, suddenly flared to life. The vibration buzzed sharply against the wood. It was an iMessage from Richard. I opened the text. An image loaded. It was a selfie taken in what looked like the VIP lounge of a European airport, likely a layover in Rome before their final descent into Paris, judging by the espresso cups and the Italian signage in the blurred background. My father was beaming, his teeth blindingly white against his artificial tan. Caroline was leaning into his shoulder, holding a glass of Prosecco, her pink acrylics wrapped delicately around the stem. They looked radiant, untouchable. Below the photo was a text, punctuated by a series of emojis. Just landed in Rome for our connection. So incredibly sad mom couldn't be here. I spent an hour on the phone with my lawyer from the lounge. We are going to sue the airline for everything they have for doing this to her. Take good care of her. Sophomore wish you were here. Hugs and kisses. I stared at the glowing message. I studied the digital pixels constructing his smiling face. He was sitting 3,000 miles away, drinking Italian wine, pretending to be the aggrieved, protective son fighting a phantom airline on behalf of the mother he had just robbed blind. The sheer, sociopathic perfection of the lie was almost architectural. It was a masterpiece of gaslighting. I didn't type back. I didn't block his number. I simply set the phone down and let the screen fade to black. Let him enjoy the Prosecco. It would be the last thing he drank in peace for a very long time. I turned my attention away from the digital world and looked at the physical space around me. A man who orchestrates a 3-year financial drain doesn't leave all his secrets in the cloud. He leaves paper trails. My grandfather's desk had heavy, deep drawers on either side. I began with the bottom right, the one where Beatrice kept her tax filings. I systematically pulled out folders, discarding old utility receipts and appliance warranties, until I found a heavy, unmarked manila envelope tucked far in the back, wedged beneath a stack of blank stationery. It felt unusually dense. I untied the string closure and slid the contents onto the desk. It was a stack of legal documents, printed on thick, high-cotton paper. The header on the first page read, Connecticut Quitclaim Deed. I leaned closer, my eyes scanning the dense, legal jargon. A quitclaim deed is a mechanism used to quickly transfer the title of a property from one person to another, often used between family members to bypass the traditional sale process. I flipped to the second page. The grantor was listed as Beatrice Vance. The grantee, the person receiving the property, was Richard Vance. But it was the final page that made the temperature in the room drop by 10 degrees. The document was fully drafted, requiring only Beatrice's signature and a notary stamped to become legally binding. Clipped to the front of the packet was a small, yellow post-it note, written in Richard's slanted, hurried handwriting. Filing appointment with the county clerk scheduled for Thursday, 9 a.m. Need mom's signature before the flight. I looked at the date on my computer screen. Today was Tuesday. My father hadn't just drained her savings. He had realized the liquid cash was drying up, and he had made his final play for the house itself. The house Beatrice had lived in for 40 years. The house she was sitting in right now drinking her tea. He had likely intended to slip this document into a pile of trip-related waivers and have her sign it in the chaos of packing, but the timing hadn't worked out. He was exactly 48 hours away from transferring my grandmother's $2 million estate entirely into his own name. If he had succeeded, he could have legally evicted her the moment he returned from Paris. I sat back in the leather chair, my fingers resting lightly on the cold edge of the desk. The puzzle was complete. The scope of the betrayal was no longer a theory. It was a physical, undeniable reality resting under the glow of my desk lamp. He thought he had all the time in the world. He thought he was playing a game against a fragile widow who didn't understand the rules. He had forgotten about the accountant in the room. The heavy, cotton blend pages of the unexecuted quitclaim deed felt unnaturally heavy in my hands as I walked out of my grandfather's study. I carried the documents, the deed, the highlighted spreadsheets, the Delaware LLC registry, pressed against my chest, not like a shield, but like a loaded weapon. The hallway of the new Canaan house was dark now, the evening shadows stretching long and sharp across the polished hardwood floors. When I stepped back into the sitting room, Beatrice was exactly where I had left her. She hadn't moved. The only difference was the ambient light. The sun had fully set, leaving her illuminated only by the warm, amber glow of a single brass reading lamp. On the mahogany side table, her cup of Earl Grey tea sat untouched. A thin, translucent film had formed over the dark liquid, the undeniable physical evidence of time passing in absolute stillness. I sat down in the wingback chair across from her. I didn't sigh. I didn't offer a preamble laced with pity or emotional cushioning. Pity implies that the victim is helpless, and I needed my grandmother to be razor-sharp for what was about to happen. I placed the stack of papers on the glass surface of the coffee table. The soft thud echoed in the quiet room. I began to explain. I didn't use words like theft, betrayal, or lies. Those words are emotionally volatile. They invite denial. Instead, I spoke the language of my profession. I spoke of unauthorized capital outflows, systemic asset depletion, and shell corporations. I walked her through the spreadsheets, pointing to the columns of red numbers. I showed her the steady, parasitic drain of $196,800 over 36 months. I explained how Crestview Holdings was not an accounting firm or a travel agency, but a hollow digital bucket owned by her son, designed specifically to catch the liquid assets he was siphoning from her retirement and healthcare funds. Beatrice listened. She didn't interrupt. Her pale blue eyes tracked my index finger as it moved down the ledger, line by line, date by date. Then, I slid the final document across the glass. The quitclaim deed. I explained the legal mechanics of it. I told her that in exactly 48 hours, Richard had planned to file this paper with the county clerk, effectively erasing her ownership of the home she was currently sitting in. I waited for the collapse. I waited for the tears, the denial, the hysterical defense of her only son. I had seen corporate executives break down and weep over far less. But Beatrice didn't cry. Something remarkable happens when a woman of her generation, a woman who has spent decades maintaining grace, swallowing slights, and managing the delicate egos of the men around her, is pushed past the absolute limit of her tolerance. The trembling in her frail hands simply stopped. A profound, glacial stillness settled over her posture. The confusion in her eyes evaporated, replaced by a clarity so cold it was almost frightening. She reached out and picked up the antique porcelain teacup. She held it for a moment, feeling the cold ceramic against her skin, perhaps grounding herself in the physical reality of the object. Then, she set it back down on its saucer. The delicate clink of china on china was the loudest sound in the room. She looked up, meeting my eyes with an unblinking stare, and spoke a single, steady sentence. "Call my lawyer." If you are watching this and you've ever found a piece of paper, a message, or a ledger that showed you exactly who your family really is, hit that subscribe button. Because this story is about what happens when you stop crying and start auditing. Stay with me. Arthur Pendleton arrived at the house 45 minutes later. He was a senior partner at a prestigious estate planning firm in Stamford, a man who smelled faintly of peppermint mints and dry-cleaned wool. He had been my grandfather's attorney, and he moved with the quiet, unhurried efficiency of a man who had seen every possible iteration of familial greed. I had already emailed him the PDFs of my findings before his tires crunched on the gravel driveway. When he walked into the sitting room, his leather briefcase in hand, there were no pleasantries. The atmosphere in the room was entirely clinical, a surgical theater prepared for a sudden amputation. He spread his own documents across the dining room table. Beatrice sat at the head, her back perfectly straight. "Beatrice," Arthur said, his voice a low, soothing baritone, "Sophia's preliminary audit is conclusive. Richard's current power of attorney gives him broad, almost unchecked fiduciary access. We're going to sever that immediately." I watched as Arthur withdrew a heavy Montblanc fountain pen from his breast pocket. He handed it to Beatrice. The process of dismantling my father's financial dominion took exactly 22 minutes. With a series of steady signatures, Beatrice executed a sweeping revocation of power of attorney. Arthur's notary seal clamped down on the heavy paper with a satisfying, metallic crunch, the sound of a steel door slamming shut and locking from the inside. But a piece of paper in Connecticut doesn't stop a wire transfer in Europe. We had to move the capital. Under Arthur's legal supervision, I initiated emergency security protocols on all of Beatrice's remaining accounts. We dissolved the vulnerable checking and savings accounts, freezing the routing numbers so nothing could flow in or out. The remaining liquid assets were immediately rolled into a newly established, ironclad revocable living trust. I set the parameters of the new trust with deliberate friction. It was a dual signature structure. Not a single cent could be moved, withdrawn, or leveraged without the cryptographic, two-factor authenticated approval of both Beatrice and myself. By the time Arthur packed his briefcase and walked out into the cool night air, Richard Vance had been entirely ghosted from his mother's financial existence. He had no authority, no access, and no legal standing. The parasite had been surgically detached from the host. Beatrice went upstairs to sleep, her posture lighter than it had been in years. I remained downstairs in the dark living room, the glow of my laptop screen illuminating the empty coffee table. There was one final loose end, the most satisfying one. I accessed the administrative portal of Beatrice's primary American Express account. Because Richard had controlled her finances, he had long ago issued supplementary platinum cards for both himself and Caroline, directly tied to Beatrice's master credit line. He had set them on a blind auto-pay cycle, allowing them to swipe indiscriminately while Beatrice's bank account silently absorbed the damage at the end of every month. I looked at the digital dashboard. I could see the pending authorizations from earlier that day, a $300 charge at the JFK Delta Sky Club, an $800 charge for a duty-free luxury watch purchase. They were already spending her money in the sky. I hover my cursor over the button labeled, Report Cards Lost/Stolen. I paused. If I canceled the cards entirely, American Express's automated fraud detection system would immediately send a text message alert and an email to Richard's phone. He would know something was wrong before he even unpacked his bags at the hotel. He would have time to panic, time to call his own bank, time to maneuver. I didn't want him to have time. I wanted him to be publicly, humiliatingly blindsided. Instead of canceling the accounts, I clicked into the Manage Spending Limits tab. The digital interface loaded, displaying a sliding bar that dictated the purchasing power of the supplementary cards. Richard's limit was set to $50,000. Caroline's was set to $30,000. With two simple, silent drags of my mouse, I pulled both digital sliders all the way to the left. Limit: $0. Save changes. The system accepted the command without a sound. No automated emails would be triggered for a limit adjustment. The cards were still technically active. They just held the purchasing power of a piece of useless plastic. I closed the laptop, letting the room plunge into total darkness. My father and mother were currently 30,000 feet over the Atlantic Ocean, dreaming of the luxury they had stolen, entirely unaware that their financial parachutes had just been cut. I knew the first blow wouldn't land at a hotel check-in desk. Hotels place pre-authorizations hours before arrival. No, the first brutal impact of reality was going to happen in public. I knew Caroline's itinerary. I knew her habits. I knew the first blow was going to land in a designer boutique in Paris. And it was going to be a beautifully quiet disaster. The morning light in Connecticut has a specific quality to it in late autumn. It doesn't warm the room. It merely exposes it. It filters through the heavy linen drapes like a pale, interrogating beam, highlighting every dust mote suspended in the air. When I walked into the kitchen at 7 o'clock on Wednesday morning, the house felt fundamentally altered. The underlying hum of vulnerability, the invisible, suffocating weight of my father's impending theft, had been completely excised from the architecture. Beatrice was already awake. She was sitting at the breakfast nook, dressed in a crisp, ivory cashmere sweater, methodically peeling a grapefruit. There was no tremor in her hands. The paralyzing confusion that had aged her by 10 years in Terminal 4 was gone, replaced by the formidable, enduring spine of a woman who had simply decided to stop being a victim. She looked up as I poured my coffee, offering a faint, microscopic nod. We didn't discuss Arthur Pendleton. We didn't discuss the revoked power of attorney or the newly established trust. The surgical extraction was complete. There was no need to examine the gauze. I took my black coffee into the study and woke up my laptop. The zeroed-out American Express limits were a beautiful, immediate mechanism of humiliation, but they were ultimately just a temporary barricade. To truly dismantle Richard Vance, to ensure he could never again leverage his mother's name or assets, I needed to introduce him to a predator much larger and far less forgiving than a forensic accountant. I needed to introduce him to the federal government. I opened a secure browser window and navigated to the Internal Revenue Service's primary portal. In my profession, the IRS is not a boogeyman. It is an instrument of absolute, mathematical equilibrium. I searched for the specific document I needed, Form 3949A, the Information Referral. It is the form used to report suspected tax fraud, unreported income, and the use of shell corporations to evade federal oversight. Filing it is a profoundly sterile experience. There is no space on the form for emotional grievances, no box to check for he abandoned his mother at an airport. The federal government does not care about broken hearts. They care about undeclared revenue. I began to type, my keystrokes sharp and rhythmic in the quiet room. Subject of referral, Richard Vance. Entity, Crestview Holdings, LLC. I didn't just fill out the basic fields. I built a prosecutorial dossier. I spent 2 hours compiling the downloaded bank ledgers, highlighting the $196,800 in fraudulent transfers. I cross-referenced the dates of those transfers with the fake invoices he had generated for consulting fees. I attached the Delaware corporate registry documents, proving he was the sole beneficiary of the shell company. I laid out the financial architecture of his theft with the clinical precision of a coroner writing an autopsy report. When the PDF package was complete, it was 74 pages long. It was an airtight, undeniable map of felony tax evasion and wire fraud. I didn't feel a rush of adrenaline as I hovered my cursor over the submit button. I felt the deep, settling satisfaction of aligning a crooked column of numbers. Revenge is hot and messy. Justice, true justice, is freezing cold. I clicked the mouse. The screen refreshed, offering a simple, automated confirmation number. Thank you for your submission. It was done. The mechanism was in motion. By the time Richard returned to American soil, his name would be flagged in a database that he could neither charm nor manipulate his way out of. I leaned back in my grandfather's leather chair and looked at the brass clock in the corner. It was just past 9 a.m. on the East Coast. Paris is 6 hours ahead. It was 3 p.m. on the Avenue Montaigne. I closed my eyes and allowed myself, just for a moment, to visualize the exact geography of their disaster. At 3 in the afternoon, Caroline would be at her absolute peak. I could picture the scene with photographic clarity, a high-end designer boutique, perhaps Dior or Chanel, bathed in soft, recessed lighting and the scent of expensive leather. She would be standing at the polished glass counter, a glass of complimentary champagne resting near her elbow, having just selected a quilted lambskin handbag that cost more than most people's monthly mortgage. Richard would be standing beside her, hands in the pockets of his tailored slacks, projecting the aura of a man who owned the world. He would offer his platinum supplementary card with that practiced, effortless flick of the wrist. The sales associate, a woman with immaculate posture and a perfectly neutral expression, would take the card. She would slide it into the heavy, brushed steel terminal. And then the quiet, devastating pause. When an account is flagged for fraud, the terminal prompts the merchant to call the bank. But when a spending limit is manually reduced to absolute zero, the system doesn't ask for clarification. It simply issues a hard, instantaneous rejection. Declined. Insufficient available credit. I could see the microscopic shift in the sales associate's demeanor. The polite, apologetic tilt of her head as she handed the plastic back. I'm so sorry, monsieur. The card has been declined. Would you care to try another? Richard would laugh it off, of course. A nervous, booming chuckle. Silly bank, always overly cautious when we travel. He would pull out his secondary card, the one tied to his own personal, heavily overdrawn checking account. He would slide it in. Declined. The champagne would suddenly taste bitter. The soft lighting of the boutique would begin to feel intensely hot, suffocating. The realization wouldn't hit them all at once. It would seep into their bones like freezing water. They were in a foreign country, surrounded by luxury, without a single cent of accessible capital. They were ghosts in a machine I had just unplugged. Right on cue, as if summoned by the sheer force of my visualization, my phone shattered the silence of the study. It didn't ring. I had kept it on silent. But the violent, sustained vibration against the polished mahogany desk sounded like a trapped insect. I opened my eyes and looked at the screen. Incoming call, Richard Vance, mobile. I didn't reach for it. I sat perfectly still, resting my chin on my steepled fingers, and watched the digital readout. The call timed out after 30 seconds. 2 seconds later, it vibrated again. Incoming call, Richard Vance Mobile. I watched the screen light up the darkened corner of the desk. The sheer desperation transmitting through the satellites, bouncing off cell towers across the Atlantic, and vibrating into the wood of my grandfather's desk was palpable. It rang a third time, then a fourth, then a fifth. By the time the onslaught paused, there were 28 missed calls stacked on my lock screen. Then, a small icon appeared. A single voicemail. I picked up the phone, unlocked it, and pressed play, lifting the speaker to my ear. I expected anger. I expected the booming, authoritative voice he used to intimidate contractors and silence my mother. Instead, I heard the sound of a man drowning in shallow water. There was the chaotic, echoing background noise of a busy Parisian street, honking horns, the distant wail of a siren, the hurried footsteps of pedestrians. And then, my father's voice. It was thin, breathless, and stripped entirely of its artificial bass. Sophia, you need to pick up the phone right now. He paused, taking a ragged, uneven breath. Something is wrong with the accounts. With Mom's cards. The hotel is demanding a deposit for the suite, and my cards are declining. All of them. Even the emergency lines. Did the bank freeze them because of the location? You have to call Arthur. Call the bank. We're standing in the lobby, and they're looking at us like, Sophia, please. Call me back immediately. I don't understand what's happening. He didn't understand. I lowered the phone and let the screen fade to black. He was a man who had spent his entire life assuming that consequences were something that only happened to other people. He had treated his mother's life savings as an infinite well, and now, standing in the opulent lobby of a Parisian hotel, he had finally hit the dry, concrete bottom. I stood up, picked up my empty coffee mug, and walked out of the study. I didn't call him back. I didn't text him an explanation. The most terrifying sound to a manipulator who is losing control isn't a scream, or a threat, or a lecture. It is the absolute, unbroken sound of silence. The next 48 hours in New Canaan unfolded with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a convalescence. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere that had choked my grandfather's house for the past 3 years had evaporated entirely. In its place, a pristine, almost echoing quiet settled into the plaster and wood. The weather turned, bringing a crisp, biting autumn chill that stripped the oak trees in the backyard bare, leaving their branches looking like fine, dark fractures against a pale gray sky. Inside, Beatrice was reclaiming her territory. I watched her from the kitchen island as she moved through the conservatory, watering her orchids with a small copper can. Her spine was straight. The hesitant, fragile shuffle that had plagued her steps at Terminal 4 was gone. When a parasite is removed from the host, the recovery is often remarkably swift. We still didn't speak of my father. We didn't need to. The legal and financial barriers we had erected around her were invisible, but they hummed with a high-voltage certainty of absolute protection. While the physical world inside the house was characterized by a serene, monastic silence, my digital world was a war zone. My iPhone, resting face up on the cool marble of the kitchen counter, had become a real-time monitor of a psychological collapse. When you sever a narcissist's access to their primary fuel source, the reaction follows a highly predictable, almost clinical sequence. First comes denial, then manufactured confusion, followed closely by a frantic, grasping manipulation. Finally, when the manipulation fails to yield results, it devolves into raw, unadulterated rage. Richard was moving through these stages at breakneck speed. Because the newly established dual signature trust had walled off Beatrice's capital, and because I had manually reduced his supplementary credit limits to exactly $0, my father was stranded in one of the most expensive cities on earth with nothing but his own overdrawn checking account. The luxury he had stolen was now a cage. The first day was marked by the blue bubbles of iMessages, arriving in sporadic bursts. Sophia, something is severely wrong with the bank. Call me. We had to put the hotel incident on Caroline's debit card, and it nearly wiped her out. This is incredibly embarrassing. Fix this. I didn't open the message. I simply let it sit on the lock screen, reading the preview text. I could picture him pacing the plush carpeting of a Parisian hotel room, adjusting his cuffs, trying to maintain the illusion of control in front of my mother. By the evening of the second day, the tone shifted. The realization that this wasn't a banking error, but a targeted blockade, was beginning to dawn on him. The typos in his messages increased, betraying his rising panic. The pristine punctuation he usually favored was replaced by fragmented, erratic outbursts. "What did you do?" "Arthur Pendleton's office won't take my calls. They said, he only represents Mom now. You have no right to interfere in my relationship with my mother. You are tearing this family apart over a misunderstanding. Call me back right now. We are literally going to be thrown out of the hotel tomorrow. They require a daily hold for incidentals, and my cards are dead. What did you say to the credit card company?" "This is illegal, Sophia. I am her son." The sheer audacity of the word illegal coming from a man who had forged invoices to siphon nearly $200,000 into a ghost corporation was almost poetic. I took a sip of my black coffee, watching the screen light up again and again. I was experiencing a deep, profound sense of equilibrium. I wasn't ignoring him out of spite or malice. I was ignoring him because engaging with the manipulator is exactly what they want. They thrive on friction. They need you to argue, to explain, to defend your actions, because the moment you engage in a dialogue, they have an entry point to twist the narrative and make themselves the victim. Silence, however, offers no leverage. Silence is a mirror. It forces them to look exclusively at the consequences of their own actions. On the morning of the third day, the war expanded. My inbox chimed with an incoming email. The sender name was Caroline Vance. My mother had never been the architect of the theft, but she was its most dedicated beneficiary. She was a woman who measured her worth entirely by the labels on her clothing and the zip codes of her vacations. The sudden, violent cessation of cash flow must have felt like a physical assault to her. The subject line was blank. I opened the email. "Sophia, I don't know what kind of sick, jealous game you are playing, but you have gone too far this time. Your father is on the verge of a heart attack. We had to cancel our dinner reservations at Lambroisi. We are eating sandwiches in the room because we are terrified to run a tab. You have always hated us. You have always been a cold, spiteful little girl who couldn't stand to see anyone else happy. When we get home, you're going to pack your bags and get out of Beatrice's house. You will pay for this humiliation." I read the paragraph twice. I paid attention to the specific details she chose to highlight, not the well-being of her elderly mother-in-law, who she had abandoned at an airport, not the morality of the situation. Her breaking point was the cancellation of a Michelin-starred dinner and the indignity of eating room-temperature sandwiches. Her grievance was entirely cosmetic. I didn't delete the email. I dragged it into a designated folder labeled Evidence, Vance C. Every threat, every panicked admission, every attempt at intimidation was just more data, neatly categorized and archived for the inevitable legal fallout. By noon, the frantic energy of the messages from Richard began to curdle into something darker. The battery of texts turned into a stream of voicemails. I didn't listen to them, but the automated transcriptions on my phone painted a vivid picture of a man suffocating under the weight of his own hubris. He was no longer demanding. He was begging, heavily laced with venom. It was time to end the noise. It was time to show him the true shape of the architecture I had built around him while he was in the air. I carried my laptop into the study, the heavy oak door closing behind me with a solid, satisfying click. I didn't want to argue with him over iMessage. I wanted to deliver a psychological strike so absolute, so devoid of emotion, that it would completely paralyze him. A forensic accountant doesn't fight in the mud. We fight on paper. I opened my encrypted mail client. I didn't address the email to my father or my mother. I addressed it to a man named David Harris. David was a mid-level CPA based in Greenwich, Connecticut, who handled the tax preparations for Richard's legitimate real estate business, as well as his personal filings. I had found his contact information embedded in the metadata of the fraudulent Crestview Holdings invoices. In the CC field, I carefully typed Richard's primary email address. I didn't draft a manifesto. I didn't explain the airport, or the tiers, or the revoked power of attorney. I kept my hands perfectly steady over the keyboard and typed a single, devastatingly precise sentence. Dear Mr. Eris, please be advised that Richard Vance's recent and historical capital transfers involving Crestview Holdings, LLC are currently under federal audit regarding suspected wire fraud and tax evasion. Moving forward, any inquiries regarding the estate of Beatrice Vance should be directed to her legal counsel, Arthur Pendleton. Regards, Sophia Vance. I read the sentence one more time, letting the legal phrasing roll over in my mind. It was a masterpiece of corporate hostility. By sending it to his accountant, I wasn't just threatening him, I was alerting the very person responsible for keeping him out of prison that the ship was already sinking. The accountant, legally bound to protect his own license, would immediately drop Richard as a client the moment he read the words Federal Audit. I clicked send. The progress bar swept across the bottom of the screen, a tiny blue arrow launching into the digital ether, carrying a payload that would detonate the moment it landed in Paris. I closed the laptop and picked up my phone. I didn't have to wait long. 20 minutes later, the read receipt triggered on the email. I watched the screen of my iPhone, waiting for the inevitable explosion. I expected the calls to double in volume. I expected threats of lawsuits, strings of profanity, an apocalyptic digital meltdown. But nothing happened. The hour passed. Then 2 hours. The afternoon sun began to bleed through the window panes, casting long, dusty rectangles across the Persian rug. The silence in the room stretched out, unbroken and profound. The barrage of blue bubbles completely ceased. No calls. No emails from Caroline. The frantic, aggressive energy that had defined the last 3 days was instantly snuffed out, replaced by a suffocating, absolute void. It was the silence of a man who had finally realized he was no longer playing a game of family dynamics. He had just realized he was playing a game of federal survival, and he had already lost. He wasn't thinking about Michelin-starred restaurants or my grandmother's house anymore. He was thinking about prison. I leaned back in my grandfather's chair, interlacing my fingers behind my head, and listened to the grandfather clock ticking in the corner. There are many ways to remove toxic people from your life. You can scream, you can cry, you can slam doors and beg them to change. Or you can simply cut their supply lines, sign the paperwork, and wait for the magnificent, terrifying silence that proves just how small they truly are. 21 days is a remarkably brief period of time in the grand architecture of a human life. It is precisely 3 weeks, 504 hours. In the context of a geological epoch, it is nothing. But in the realm of human psychology, 21 days of sustained, inescapable financial starvation is enough to completely dismantle the foundation of a narcissist. By the time the 21st day arrived, the house in New Canaan had fundamentally transformed. The walls no longer seemed to absorb the ambient anxiety that had characterized my grandfather's estate for the past 3 years. Instead, the property had settled into a state of pristine, unyielding peace. The air inside smelled of roasted coffee beans, dried lavender, and the lemon oil Beatrice used on the antique mahogany tables. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn back every morning to let in the sharp, pale light of late autumn. Beatrice herself had discarded the heavy wool trench coat she had worn to Terminal 4. She moved through the spacious rooms in light cashmere, her steps measured, purposeful, and entirely her own. The ghost of her vulnerability had been completely exorcised. I knew exactly what time their return flight was scheduled to land at JFK. I knew how long it would take them to clear customs, and I knew how long the drive from Queens to Fairfield County took in mid-morning traffic. I didn't track their flight on my phone. I didn't need to. I simply sat by the large, arched window in the front drawing room, a ceramic mug of black coffee warming my hands, and watched the long gravel driveway. The weather was perfectly suited for a homecoming. A hard, early frost had killed the remaining hydrangeas overnight, leaving the manicured front lawn looking brittle and gray under an overcast sky. The air outside was freezing, still, and unforgiving. At precisely 11:40 in the morning, the sound broke the silence. It was the distinct, heavy crunch of tires on gravel. I didn't move from my chair. I only shifted my gaze. It wasn't a sleek black town car. It wasn't the luxury chauffeur service Richard always insisted upon to maintain his carefully curated image of wealth. It was a standard, battered yellow taxi, its sides streaked with highway salt and airport grime. The vehicle pulled to a slow, shuddering halt at the base of the front steps. I watched the doors open. When you cut off a man's access to his stolen capital, you don't just change his bank balance, you change his physical posture. The man who stepped out of the taxi did not look like the man who had abandoned his mother at Terminal 4. The artificial, booming charisma was gone. Richard's shoulders were slumped, his expensive Italian wool topcoat looking wrinkled and oversized on his frame. He didn't wait for the driver to open the trunk. He walked to the back of the cab and dragged his own heavy leather suitcase out onto the driveway, the expensive wheels scraping harshly against the loose stones. Caroline emerged from the other side. The 21 days in Paris had clearly not been a dream. Without the padding of limitless, stolen credit, the City of Lights had become a beautiful, expensive prison. Her pale pink acrylic nails, usually immaculate, were chipped. Her hair lacked its usual salon blowout, pulled back into a tight, severe knot. She looked exhausted, her movements rigid with the unspoken, simmering resentment of a woman who had been promised a life of effortless luxury and was instead handed a terrifying dose of reality. They left the suitcases on the gravel and walked up the front steps together. I took a slow, quiet sip of my coffee. The ceramic was warm against my lower lip. Through the thick glass of the drawing room window, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the heavy oak front door. I watched Richard reach into his pocket and pull out his brass keyring. He stepped up to the lock, inserted the familiar key, and attempted to turn it with a practiced flick of his wrist. It didn't turn. He paused. I could see the slight furrow of his brow. He pulled the key out, checked it, and pushed it back into the cylinder. He twisted harder this time, his knuckles turning white with the effort. The lock remained completely, definitively dead. Arthur Pendleton had been exceptionally thorough. The morning after the newly established trust was finalized, I had hired a premium locksmith from Stamford. Every deadbolt, every handle, every security keypad on the estate had been completely replaced. The house was now a fortress, and Richard was holding a key to a kingdom that no longer existed. It was only after his third frantic attempt to force the lock that his eyes drifted upward, noticing the anomaly on the door itself. Taped meticulously to the heavy brass knocker, directly at eye level, was a thick, legal-sized manila envelope. It was sealed with red tape and bore the embossed logo of Arthur Pendleton's law firm. Richard's hand trembled slightly as he pulled the envelope free from the tape. He ripped the top open, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. Caroline stepped closer to him, peering over his shoulder, her face drawn and pale in the freezing air. I watched him unfold the heavy, high-cotton papers. He wasn't just reading a notice of changed locks. He was reading a comprehensive, legally binding notice of eviction and a formal declaration of trespass. The documents detailed the immediate revocation of his residency rights. Tucked beneath those pages was the final, devastating blow, a temporary restraining order, signed by a county judge, legally barring Richard Vance from coming within 500 feet of Beatrice Vance or her properties, pending the results of the ongoing federal audit into Crestview Holdings, LLC. The realization hit him like a physical strike. I watched his knees buckle just a fraction of an inch. The papers slipped in his hands. He looked up from the documents, staring blankly at the heavy oak door. He knew I was inside. He knew, with absolute, terrifying clarity, that the architect of his destruction was sitting just feet away, separated by a few inches of wood and a mountain of impenetrable legal barricades. Caroline didn't yell. The fight had been entirely drained out of her. She simply turned her back on the house, wrapped her arms tightly around her own chest, and began walking slowly back down the stairs toward the waiting taxi. She didn't look back at him. The alliance, built entirely on the flow of stolen money, was already fracturing. Richard stood alone on the porch for a full minute. He didn't knock. He didn't shout my name or demand to see his mother. To scream at a locked door is to admit defeat, and his ego, though shattered, wouldn't allow for the public humiliation. He simply folded the papers back into the envelope, his movements slow and robotic. He turned around, walked down the steps, and loaded his luggage back into the trunk. The yellow cab reversed down the driveway, the tires crunching against the gravel one last time, before disappearing down the winding, tree-lined road. They were gone. I set my empty mug down on the windowsill. The silence in the drawing room remained perfectly intact. I walked out of the room, down the long hallway, and into the kitchen. I prepared a fresh tray, 2 delicate, gold-rimmed porcelain cups, a silver pot of freshly steeped Earl Grey tea, and a small plate of lemon biscuits. I carried the tray toward the back of the house, pushing open the glass French doors that led to the enclosed, heated winter veranda. Beatrice was sitting in her favorite wicker chair, a thick woolen blanket draped elegantly over her knees, reading a hardback biography. The morning light filtered beautifully through the glass, catching the silver strands in her perfectly coiffed hair. She looked up as I approached, a soft, genuine smile touching the corners of her mouth. "Is it done, Sophia?" she asked, her voice calm and steady. She didn't ask if he had cried. She didn't ask if he had been angry. I set the silver tray down on the small glass table between us. I looked at the 2 cups. "Just 2. "Yes, Grandma," I said quietly, taking my seat opposite her. "It's done." The locks held. She nodded once, a gesture of profound, quiet acceptance. She reached out with a steady hand, lifting her porcelain cup. The china didn't tremble. Family is a concept heavily romanticized by society. We are told that blood is an unbreakable bond, an infinite well of forgiveness that we must draw from, no matter how toxic the water becomes. But standing in the wreckage of a 3-year theft, looking at the peace radiating from my grandmother's face, I knew the truth. Family ties are not forged by blood. They are proven by loyalty. They are built on the quiet, unglamorous foundation of mutual protection. You do not owe your life, your resources, or your sanity to someone simply because you share a genetic sequence. You don't have to slam doors and yell or get into long, exhausting arguments to cut someone out of your life. Sometimes simply cutting them off, signing the papers, and changing the locks creates the perfect silence you need to realize just how empty they are.